The push for el-Obeid. The rapid support forces are trying to seize this strategic southern city from the Sudanese military. Rights groups are warning of a potential humanitarian catastrophe. But why is the battle to control the city so important? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. In Sudan, the strategic city is known as the Bride of Sands. And for weeks, el-Obeid has been targeted by intense attacks from the paramilitary rapid support forces, some of the worst since the conflict began in 2023. Many analysts say that if the RSF can seize the city, it will strengthen its grip on Western Sudan. It's currently under control of the Sudanese army, which is trying to hold off the RSF's advance. But as the battle for the city escalates, hundreds of thousands of civilians are paying the price. Aid groups are warning of the risk of mass atrocities and a humanitarian catastrophe as people caught up in the fighting are unable to flee. We'll discuss the likely outcomes of the ongoing battle in a moment, but first, this report from Hiba Morgan.
This is what a recent RSF drone strike did to a house in the city of el-Obeid in Sudan's North Kordofan state. At least 8 people lost their lives in this attack, adding to the many others who've been killed in RSF drone strikes as the paramilitary group targets el-Obeid, which is controlled by the Sudanese army.
We heard the strike around the corner and then it hit our neighbor's house. We came running and found them alive and got them out. Then the owner of the house and 2 others entered to bring the car keys. That's when the third strike happened.
El-Obeid, capital of North Kordofan, is important to both sides of the conflict. It's about 400 kilometers from the capital Khartoum, which the army regained control of last year. And to its west is the Darfur region, where the RSF is in charge. Controlling el-Obeid for the army means keeping Khartoum safe, but also being able to launch an offensive to retake Darfur. For the RSF, the city's control means a tighter grip on the western region and brings it closer to the capital. The RSF has been trying to take control of el-Obeid since the start of the war with the army in 2023. But in the past weeks, it's increased its use of drones, with its targets going beyond just the army base to include residential areas as well as fuel supplies. That's created fuel shortages in the city. The constant strikes have also affected water supplies in the city, where about 500,000 people are living. Lines like these have become common. Here, water pumps are operated using small generators to reduce the scarcity.
We suffer because of the water issue. We wake up at 3 and leave the kids alone, and sometimes they go to school without having tea because there's no water.
International humanitarian groups say the RSF is trying to impose a full blockade on the city before launching an offensive, and that's raising fears for the hundreds of thousands there. The groups say an RSF offensive on el-Obeid will result in a bloodbath similar to what happened in Fasher, where thousands were killed last October after an RSF siege. The UN says civilians in el-Obeid, and especially children, need to be protected.
We need immediate action to prevent further escalation, particularly in and around el-Obeid. Humanitarian corridors to move civilians out to safety are essential, as well as the establishment of child protection services for children who are separated from their families. We cannot allow another Fasher.
In a recent report, rights groups Amnesty International said the RSF committed crimes against humanity on its assault on Fasher, including torture and sexual violence, which the RSF had denied. Amnesty is also calling for an international force to be deployed in Sudan to protect the millions of people requiring humanitarian assistance and help end the conflict. Hiba Morgan, Al Jazeera, Khartoum for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Joining us from Nairobi is Mahmoud Ali, Sudan researcher with the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. In London is Kholood Khair, founding director of Confluence Advisory, a think tank founded in Khartoum with a focus on Sudan. And in New Haven, Connecticut is Nathaniel Raymond, executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale School of Public Health. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Kholood, let me start with you. As the war in Sudan rages on, how important is this battle around the city of el-Obeid? How strategic is the city overall, not just location-wise, but also as a commercial center?
Absolutely, it's incredibly important. El-Obeid has been a historical center of commerce and capital. It was on the Hajj route when pilgrims used to come from West Africa all the way through Sudan to Mecca, and because of that, it's also become the center for regional products, gum Arabic, cattle, etc. And so whoever controls El-Obeid effectively gets to control some of those markets as well. So it's not just a military objective, but also a commercial one. And this is actually very much part and parcel of how we have seen the RSF prosecute this war. For the Sudanese armed forces, it's very important that they retain control over Fasher because they hope to open up access to West Kordofan and Darfur come the dry season in October. For the RSF, it's really important for them to get a hold of el-Obeid because that opens up a route back into the central part of the country, back into the capital, as they have promised to do ever since leaving the capital in March of 2025 after the SAF kicked them out.
So Ali, you heard Kholood there talk about the importance for the RSF of trying to capture el-Obeid. Based on where things stand right now, I want to get your take on this. Do you think that it is a strong possibility that the RSF could fully capture el-Obeid? And I want to ask you about the logistics of all this. How easy might that be, and how difficult might that be?
Well, the situation now in el-Obeid is really alarming, as the RSF started to mobilize troops around el-Obeid from three directions, from the north and the west and the south. But the battle for controlling el-Obeid is not something new. El-Obeid was on siege for almost 2 years from the beginning of the war in April 2023. But SAF managed to well defend the city and push the RSF outside the city. And after the SAF opened the road to Obeid through Kosti, they managed to bring more troops and more military equipment to defend el-Obeid. And since then, the SAF established el-Obeid as the strategic military hub for the Western fronts. And it's hard to capture el-Obeid for the RSF, I think, because the deployment of the troops there and the open trains around el-Obeid, it's hard to build a siege as the RSF is like pattern for taking cities, build up a siege around the city and exhaust the city resources and so on. But it's still harder in el-Obeid for the RSF to take it in the near future.
Nathaniel, what's the overall humanitarian picture on the ground in el-Obeid now? I'm talking about what is it like as far as access to water, as far as access to medical supplies, access to fuel. We've heard concerns from humanitarian groups that things are getting worse also because they say that the RSF is utilizing drones more in the last few weeks as well.
Our team at the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health released a report yesterday, which was able to corroborate that about 30% of the gas stations and fuel reserves inside el-Obeid have been hit by some form of UAV, some form of drone. Additionally, the substation that provides the main power, electrical power to the city, has been hit. And why this is so significant from a humanitarian perspective is that the water pumps for the city run on access to fuel and electricity. And right now, we think those pumps are starting to fail. And the risk here is of waterborne disease where people don't have clean water. And so they start drinking other available water sources that are contaminated. It's the rainy season now, and the risk of cholera is high. So the main sort of vehicle for civilian casualties separate from the crossfire and the drones, is a outbreak of cholera or other waterborne disease for people in large groups with no access to potable water.
Kholood, I want to ask you a little bit about the local makeup in and around el-Obeid. There are, as I understand it, groups that are supportive of the Sudanese military in and around el-Obeid, but they don't always see eye to eye, do they? And I want to ask you that if that's the case, how much that complicates the picture going forward.
That's right. The SAF coalition, which is made up of a large number of different armed groups, is not one that is having a lot of coherence right now. For example, you have the Jihadi Barra ibn Malik Corps, as they are now called, and they have a very sort of jihadi, very Islamist ideology that guides a lot of their work, and including, of course, their armed, the nature of their armed work with the Sudanese armed forces. Then you have the joint forces are primarily made up of former rebels from Darfur, and they have espoused historically quite sort of a liberal perspective, if you will. And those two groups do not see eye to eye on many agendas. They're not fighting effectively for the same thing. They may right now have an enmity with the RSF, but they have historically not been fighting each other, actually. And so what we have also is the presence of the Popular Defense Forces, or PDFs. These were also Islamist militias created by the Bashir regime, and they're also active in al-Obeid. How all of these disparate groups will necessarily find common cause beyond just beating the RSF remains to be seen. And even if they are able to repel attacks from the RSF, what does that mean for the future of al-Obeid as a new sort of garrison town of this SAF coalition?
Ali, you stated before that you didn't necessarily think it would be easy for the RSF to recapture or to capture el-Obeid. I want to ask you a little bit more about that. First of all, how much might social dynamics on the ground in el-Obeid play a role in what happens going forward? I mean, what might local communities do there if, in fact, the RSF were to advance further, if they were to take the city? And how might that impact being able to maintain control over the city?
So if we like monitored how like the RSF overtook every area, like every town in Darfur, for example, the Fasher or Niala and Baba Nusa, the RSF first trying to build a siege around the city from all directions and displace the civilians around the cities. So we saw after like the SAF push the RSF outside of the central region, the RSF used the area that around al-Obeid before as a supply route to Khartoum, and then this area lost its significance for the RSF. So they started to try to target civilians. They targeted civilians around Bara and Mazroub. These areas are on the route to central regions or to Khartoum or to North Darfur. So the communities there mobilized in self-defense militias like in Dar Hamid and Kababish and other communities. So these communities are now running like the trade between the SAF and RSF controlled regions, and they have their own convoys and their own militias to protect these convoys, trade convoys. So whenever the RSF engaging with them, they mobilized against the RSF, and the RSF de-escalate because of the significance of these areas and how they could impact them if they allied with SAF in any future or in any case.
Nathaniel, you were talking before about how dire the humanitarian situation has grown. I want to ask you a little bit about the hundreds of thousands of people that are being impacted by this in el-Obeid. You have 500,000 people living there. There's also about 200,000 displaced people from other parts of Kordofan. They've sought refuge in the city. What happens to them right now? How bad is the situation for them? And our teams, our humanitarian teams, actually able to get them any aid at the moment?
Well, this is the critical question. We have a situation that's currently called Integrated Phase Classification 4, which is the second highest level of food insecurity. And that means that people are already in an emergency posture as it relates to food scarcity. They're using coping strategies, and we're seeing significant amounts of malnutrition, particularly amongst children. There is one road out, and it's important for your viewers to understand that basically el-Obeid is a funnel. There's one main road in and one main road out. While SAF controls the road on the eastern side, there are reports that humanitarian convoys are not able to make it in right now. And really the key worry is that that eastern passage gets cut off. If there is an RSF encirclement, which we don't fully see yet based on available data, but if that eastern road is cut off and humanitarian deliveries can't make it in, an already precarious food and water situation is going to get a lot worse. And really, what we worry about is if the city was to fall, those internally displaced persons and the remaining civilians in the city would be in a rush to try to make it out that back door exit. And that could cause significant secondary casualties, especially if SAF responds with significant air bombardment, which they did in the case of Fasher. And so we have a potential for additional casualties if people are caught in the crossfire, and basically what's a funnel.
Well, as those humanitarian concerns grow, we've also heard from Amnesty International, which is calling for an international force to be deployed in Sudan. In its latest report, the human rights organization says the Rapid Support Forces committed crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing during its campaign to seize el-Fasher in North Darfur. The RSF's crimes included murder, forcible transfer, imprisonment, torture, sexual violence, and enslavement. Amnesty International says its data shows that people were persecuted based on their ethnicity. Kholood, let me ask you about the fact that there have been humanitarian groups that are warning that any RSF offensive on el-Obeid could result, potentially, in a bloodbath that would be similar to what happened in el-Fasher. Last October, thousands of people were killed there after an RSF siege. How reminiscent is this push toward el-Obeid to what happened in el-Fasher?
I think there are a lot of symmetries. We're seeing, for example, the siege and starvation tactics that both the other panelists highlighted. We're seeing that civilian infrastructure, for example, power stations, fuel supply, are all being cut off. Humanitarian aid is not able to get in. We're seeing a very sort of tactical, very intentional policy here by the RSF to effectively choke off el-Obeid and starve out the city. We saw this very much in al-Fasher. What we are expecting to see also, if this follows the same pattern as al-Fasher, is a telecommunications blackout across all different types of communications, including radio communications. That would be through the use of jammers, etc. I think once we start to see those kinds of elements being deployed, it will signal that the RSF is pretty close to taking the city. But el-Obeid is not al-Fasher. Even though you have similar dynamics related to, for example, the fact that it has become a sanctuary city, and a lot of those people don't have anywhere to go. What we, I think, need to sort of see is that lessons have been learned from al-Fasher. And while we have seen an uptick in diplomatic engagement on al-Fasher, we have seen statements come out from the international community, the UN, as well as individual nations, which we didn't see in the run-up to al-Fasher, though many of us were raising the alarm for years. And despite the fact that we see those statements today, we don't actually see any concrete action taking place. And I think this is what, in many ways, gives the RSF leave, as they see it, to prosecute this war how they want to commit genocide effectively when and where they want, because there is no or else. There are no consequences, either for them or indeed any of their supporters or backers. And this is unfortunately the precedent that al-Fasher has set, which el-Obeid now looks set to be victim of.
Kholood, let me just also follow up with you. You mentioned the fact that there are so many people that are trapped in el-Obeid with no place to go. There have been reports that among the civilians in el-Obeid, that even if they had the opportunity to leave, that they would consider, many of them, that that might actually be more dangerous. I want to ask you what you're hearing on that front.
So a lot of people in el-Obeid are planning not to leave. They say, where would I go? If I go to Khartoum or another city, I will be forced to pay through the nose for rent, for basic amenities, and they don't have the money to be able to leave. Leaving in many ways is only reserved for those with some level of means. And then there are people who say, well, I might die, on the way out of el-Obeid. I might die on the road, like we saw many people leaving Fasher, being killed by the RSF as they left. But there's also, there's this sense that if I'm going to leave, I'm going to die in my own home, or surrounded by my family, surrounded by community, because there's a lot of precarity in being displaced as well, whether that's being displaced within the borders of Sudan or being displaced in the near abroad. For example, those who've been to Egypt find it very, very difficult to stay there, and many have returned. So it's a very difficult, it's not really a choice, but it's a very difficult decision that people have had to make, knowing also full well that the SAF is both incapable, the National Army is incapable and oftentimes unwilling to protect them. What we saw in Fasher was that where the SAF was able to drop airdrops, they dropped weapons and then food only to their soldiers. We are not seeing any significant plans by the Sudanese armed forces to provide any kind of refuge or protection, or indeed food and other amenities to the people of Fasher. So the people of el-Obeid. So the people of el-Obeid are effectively caught between the hammer of the RSF and the anvil of the SAF.
Nathaniel, I saw you just now reacting to what Kholood was saying. It looked like you wanted to jump in, so please go ahead.
What we have to understand is that the SAF is not a civilian protection force. They are trying to maintain the 5th Division headquarters in el-Obeid. They've built around 51 kilometers of defensive fortifications, but they have not prioritized, as Kholood is saying, the urgent Geneva Convention requirement to assist civilians in 2 ways. One, to provide them food and water, and the other is to provide them safe passage if they choose to leave. At this point, SAF is focused on maintaining its strategic position to prevent RSF getting the crossroads towards Omdurman and Khartoum more than they're focused on protecting civilians. So we need to be clear-eyed. SAF is not there as a civilian protection force. They're trying to protect their strategic advantage.
And Nathaniel, just to make clear, when you say SAF, you're talking about the Sudanese Armed Forces, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Ali, a moment ago, we were talking about the fact that Amnesty International is now calling for an international force to be deployed in Sudan, partly to protect the millions of people who are going to be requiring humanitarian assistance. I want to ask you if you think that's actually a viable option at this stage. Do you see that as something that could potentially happen?
Well, I don't think that could happen anytime soon, because I don't like the situation now is chaotic. We see like the whole country is being militarized, even that the region that are safe and so on, that became like sources for fighters and militias. We see like emerging of militias in eastern Sudan. In also we saw how like the people responded to SAF call for mobilizations, and I think if there is any international force being deployed, I think this will complicate the matter like more, because I'm not seeing like how this could be like implemented, and I'm not sure. Like I don't have a vision of seeing like international troops being deployed.
Kholood, it looked like you wanted to add perhaps to what Ali was saying. Did you?
The reason we're not having a protection of civilians force, or even the conversation or discussion around the protection of civilians force being deployed, is because the international community has shown a great unwillingness to put one together and indeed to fund one. And when this has come up, Amnesty International are not the first organization or indeed civil society group to say that this is necessary, and indeed it remains a necessity. This has been something that has been quite a key demand of civil society, both Sudanese and international civil society, since the start of the war. But we have seen opposition at the UN, we have seen opposition even within the African Union, closer to home, and we have seen, of course, opposition from the Sudanese armed forces. They will not accept a foreign troop deployment, even if it is to protect civilians from the RSF, within the boundaries of Sudan. And because a lot of entities are engaging the Sudanese armed forces as the de facto authorities, as the government, so to speak, they unfortunately are in a position to stand in the way of that deployment. But that does not mean that that deployment is not necessary. In the early 2000s, when the Darfur genocide was taking place, this was also a key demand of civilian actors and civil society then. At the time, the Bashir regime absolutely rejected the idea, but there was then later consensus because of the scale of the devastation and atrocity. There was consensus within the UN Security Council to allow, to push Bashir to accept a protection of civilians force, which then later became the UN-AU hybrid mission, UNAMID. That political will no longer exists, but the international community has the duty to come up with an alternative. If not a protection of civilians force, then how to protect life in Sudan needs to be at the center of all diplomatic discussions.
Nathaniel, I saw you nodding along to some of what Kholood was saying. What are your thoughts when it comes to the potential deployment of any kind of international force to at least try to protect some of the civilians there?
In 2015, I served as an advisor in the UN mission in South Sudan, peacekeeping force. When we first gave our warnings on Fasher as the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale to the UN Security Council in July of 2023, I was asked by members of the Security Council what it would take to deploy a protection force for Fasher. And the political, logistical, and really human resources obstacles are so immense in the vacuum of no political will that Kholood and Ali were speaking to, that right now it's too little too late to even have this conversation. We need to be talking about what we can deploy now, which is what has not been deployed for 3 years, which is meaningful consequences on the backers of the RSF, which is the United Arab Emirates. At the end of the day, there is a giant elephant in the room, and the elephant
Nathaniel,
lives in Abu Dhabi.
We just need to mention also that the UAE has denied any involvement in the conflict. All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Ali Mahmoud Ali, Kholood Khair, and Nathaniel Raymond. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment. Stay tuned.